Andrew, this is probably the second or third time we've had a chance to have a conversation in front of a lot of people. But the other few times we've actually been able to see and feel the people in the room. So this is going to be a little different, but I'm guessing, given your notoriety, this is not the first time you've done this.
Yes, virtual rooms are the order of the day. But it was a good time when we were in person, John,
Yeah,
in Pittsburgh and in New York.
yeah.
Yeah, I remember them both fondly.
Yeah, as do I. For those of you who've been under a rock for the past year, Andrew is an entrepreneur, an author. That's his book that's peeking over his right shoulder there. And a presidential candidate. I guess former is now the adjective we would use, although possibly in the future, a presidential candidate again. We'll get into that. And now the founder or co-founder of a really interesting organization called Humanity Forward. And that's where I want to start, Andrew. If you can tell folks what it is Humanity Forward is doing, what its mission is, and why you started it now.
My presidential campaign was based on the idea that our workforce is being transformed before our eyes in very tough ways for many, many Americans. And I championed universal basic income as a path forward. And Humanity Forward is now taking that case around the country, supporting local candidates and congressional candidates who believe in universal basic income as a necessary next step. And right now, the surveys I've seen say between 70 and 80% of Americans support emergency cash relief in people's hands in response to the tens of millions of jobs that have been lost. So Humanity Forward is making that case politically, but we're also giving money away directly ourselves just to demonstrate that this is what we should be doing. So we've given away approximately 4 million to date. We'll be up to 6 million, I think, by the end of this week, thanks to Jack Dorsey and others. And we're just giving that money in increments of $250 up to $1,000 in some cases, but generally $250, just to say, look, this is what we should be doing for our people, and hopefully we can demonstrate through our own actions what our government should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Jack Dorsey gift was quite something, and that's part of his setting aside $1 billion of his wealth, now $1.5 billion because the stock's gone up, as I understand it, to support change, systemic change in our society. Are you when you set this up? Is it are you doing a study of this? Are you trying to sort of prove something in terms of? I know you're very data driven. Your hats say math. Make America think again. Make America think harder. Forgive me. Is this part of a data-driven experiment to be able to roll out some results?
We are running a long-term study in a town called Hudson in New York State, where we're giving people $500 a month for 5 years and then studying that impact. But the vast majority of the micro grants that Humanity Forward is giving away are just to help people, really.
Yeah.
And as much as I love data, and I do love data, I'm very confident that if you've lost 40 million jobs and you're being inundated with heartbreaking requests, that the money going into people's hands is a good thing. Like I don't need, I don't necessarily need like a PhD to follow that person around and see whether the money was spent in particular ways. And we're trying to demonstrate that our government should have the same attitude. It's like people are suffering, people are dying. We have crisis upon a crisis upon a crisis in this country. And it's reprehensible that our government is not doing what 70-80% of our citizens feel is the right thing to do. It's the obvious thing to do. So we love data. We try and get data, but right now, mission number one is helping people get through this time.
Yeah, and you mentioned sort of this, nesting doll of crises we have, and I want to both acknowledge and ask your comments on the most recent of those in the last 2 weeks. Certainly, they're all interrelated. A health crisis, economic crisis, and now a crisis of faith in the system of justice that we have in this country, which has been long, overdue. One could argue. What are your thoughts on what's happened across America in the last couple of weeks?
Well, it's a heartbreaking time for many Americans, particularly those who have been subject to police violence in their own lives or have seen their communities impacted by it. So I'm going to quote Cornel West, where he said, um, it's a good thing that there's so many people out there on the streets, because can you imagine if we all saw a man's life get snuffed out and there was no reaction? Like, that would mean that we were truly lost. So I'm optimistic that the protests will lead to real change in our policing, because when I dug into the data, because I am a data guy, I looked into the numbers, and it's clear that we have a problem in this country, not just from the visceral images that we've seen, but from the numbers, where you have over 1,000 Americans die in encounters with police every year, which is much higher than any other comparable country, and you have over $1 billion in lawsuits being brought against successfully, brought against police departments also every single year. In New York, it was hundreds of millions of dollars. So if you can imagine communities spending hundreds of millions of dollars on paying off victims of police brutality, as opposed to education or healthcare or community services or infrastructure, that is happening in communities around the country. So we have a real problem, and I'm hopeful that these protests can lead towards some real solutions.
Yeah, I think that was one of the more interesting points you made in a recent podcast. I think it was with Bakari Sellers. And by the way, for those of you listening out there, check out Andrew's podcast. It's a worthy listen. But that the amount of money that's sort of being wasted because of of structural problems in how we manage our police departments that could be used to actually solve problems, as opposed to sort of push them under the carpet, it's a pretty staggering number. I wanted to move over to another crisis, and that's our economic crisis. You mentioned that a core platform and what you're well known for is UBI, Universal Basic Income. And you spent a fair amount of the time on the campaign trail, defending that, and let's be honest, a lot of mainstream commentators were dismissing you. I'm wondering if
not you though, John. Maybe
no,
that's because
not
you're
me,
not mainstream.
not me. As I said, mainstream. But I'm just wondering how it felt to you when you woke up one morning and a month or two ago and heard the news that every American is going to get a check for $1,200. Like, how did that feel? Did you feel a bit vindicated?
I felt grateful that we were doing the right thing, and grateful to everyone who supported my campaign so we could advance cash in people's hands as the right policy. And so to that level, we should just be doing more of it. That $1,200 came and went weeks and months ago, and many Americans are looking up wondering how they're going to put groceries on the table or keep a roof over their head. I mean, I just heard from someone yesterday where they're getting evicted, and like, because there are a lot of landlords out there, they're like, not my problem that you can't pay your bills because your job dried up. And that's happening in tens of millions of households around the country. So I was just glad that we could advance basic income right when the country needed it. We just need more of it.
How does that, how do you feel? I mean, you're obviously very tied into the policy discussions that are going on in Washington and in state capitals. How does it feel to you now that that sort of milestone was hit, where the government sort of created a 1 month test of it, if you will, across the whole country? How's the conversation going? Do you feel like it's more possible now, or is it already in the rearview mirror of policymakers and they're still not taking it seriously?
I wish that our legislators in Washington listened to their constituents more, because they would find that it's nearly unanimous that people liked the stimulus checks and that they need them now more than ever. Unfortunately, 80 to 90% of the money that has gone out in response to the economic crisis has not been to people. It's been to companies and firms and banks and businesses, mainly big businesses. And so I wish that ratio were reversed, where you made whole families around the country. And if you made families whole, then the businesses would do okay too, because like if we have money to spend, it's going to go to them, as opposed to doing trickle up. As opposed to doing trickle down, we should be doing trickle up.
Mhm.
But I'm very confident, John, that millions of Americans got that $1,200 check or deposit in their account, and they loved it. And they thought, wow, that was very positive. I did not become lazy overnight. Like my neighbors did not have their personalities transform. And it's clear we have the resources to do it. People are recognizing that reality as well.
Let's pull back to the larger structural reasons for a UBI platform. Can you say a little bit about the times that we are in? The role of JFF is to help address the sort of structural changes in the workforce that have been with us for decades and will be with us for decades, but seem to have been accelerated really fundamentally, both in the last few years and in the last few months. You make the point often in your podcast about how quickly we lost those jobs and how slowly, if at all, they will be coming back. To talk a little bit about the structural realities around automation and technology that are driving a need for this kind of a sweeping change in how we redistribute wealth in this country.
We're experiencing the equivalent of 10 years worth of change in 10 weeks. And I was concerned about, for example, losing hundreds of thousands of stores over time, which employed more Americans than any other industry, retail. And now we're seeing those stores close for good because you close them all for a number of months. And now many of them will not reopen. So what this pandemic did is it accelerated the trends that we were already seeing in retail and call centers and food service and transportation, Uber drivers, truck drivers, and other industries, where now every company wants to try and automate more of its work faster. And we've lost 40 million jobs officially. 40% of those jobs will not return for a host of reasons. Number one is that the economy is not going to go back to the way it was. Where if you look at your own behaviors, are you going to run out to the bar or restaurant or concert hall or movie theater or a sporting event now that things are somewhat open in parts of the country? Of course not. Like there are things that that won't be back for months or years. And if you're a firm that even is in an industry that's not directly touching some of these opportunities, you're still going to be much more cautious. Google has a hiring freeze right now. That's Google. Google's like still printing money, but they looked around and said, you know what we're not going to do? Hire any new people right now. So the job growth is going to be very, very halting. We're in a deep, dark hole, and the incentives that firms have are to do more with less.
And I'm curious, as you think about all those jobs that are being lost, 40% that won't return, that's a scary number. Do you have a positive answer to new kinds of roles that might emerge? Or perhaps, as I've read your book, you make this point in your book, we will start to value and honor jobs that haven't been called jobs before, but are truly work, such as caregiving, and things like that.
Well, that's the hope, John. And that's one reason why I'm so certain that universal basic income is necessary, because how are we going to value the work that happens in homes and communities every day unless we start to more broadly distribute value throughout our society? But if you look at the types of jobs that are going to be prized more highly in this time, it's jobs that enable you to project value digitally or over a distance. And the jobs that will be valued less are the jobs that required proximity. So that's personal trainers, yoga teachers, massage therapists, stylists, food truck operators, security guards, things where that frankly correspond to lower education and skill levels. And so that's why we should be most distressed that you're going to end up displacing many of the people in the labor market that are least able to manage a transition. They don't have tons of savings. They don't have tons of educational opportunities or job opportunities. That's going to be the reality for millions, even tens of millions of Americans.
And do you, what, you know, I don't know if I'm asking an unanswerable question, but what do you see the transition for that group of people to look like over 5 or 10 years? What, you know, are there new roles? Is there reskilling and job training? That's often what you hear politicians and policy people talk about. What's your view on how that transition to new kinds of work might go for that group of people?
Well, if you just put yourself in the position of, like, of a hairstylist who's been out of work for months, and then their hair salon, like, they now owe all this money on their rent. They're gonna, like, even reopening doesn't make sense. Like, what does that transition look like? I mean, we have to get out of fantasy land, honestly. You know, for a lot of those people, it's going to result in destitution and desperation and disintegration. You're already seeing a mental health crisis get compounded by the pandemic. So you're going to see massive surges in substance abuse, deaths of despair, people needing social assistance. And you know, I love the work that JFF does. I love people who are trying to help workers transition. But you know, who's going to help that stylist? Who's going to help that usher, that security guard? You know, like that. Um, there's just a very tough reality facing many of these people. We have to help as many people as we can. We have to invest in transitional organizations and opportunities. But if you look at it, we're going to at best increase the number of people that will successfully make this transition from, let's call it, you know, 30% to 40%, or whatever the numbers are. And that would be a heroic good. But we can't bullshit ourselves and say, like, hey, we're now going to solve the problem for 80% of these people, because we won't. Many of them will just fail.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, with that optimism,
unless, for example, our government were to start reversing the ratio of the hundreds of billions of dollars we're spending and put it into people's hands, and then they'd have a much more real chance to transition. That's the only kind of move that would work.
right? Understood. I want to, this is a bit of a left turn, but I'm personally very interested in this, and I have a feeling a lot of other folks have questions about it. One of the planks, if you will, both of your platform and now of Humanity Forward, has been around the role of data in society, and you know, data fuels automation, it fuels AI, and it fuels the tech industry, and in particular the large data processing companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and so on. I'm curious if you could tell this group what you mean by data is a property right, which is one of those, you know, planks of Humanity Forward's platform.
Well, right now, our data is getting sold and resold by the tech companies, and we're generally unaware of what's happening, and we're not seeing any of that value. Now, how much is our data worth? At this point, our data is worth billions and billions of dollars. It's fueling the valuations of trillion-dollar companies right now. And from our vantage point, there's a bargain we made. Like when we sign up for Facebook or various Google services, we say, okay, I'm going to click the I agree button, and then you're going to give me stuff, quote unquote, for free. And then I have some sense that you're advertising to me. These ads seem to follow me around anywhere I go at this point. Like, I don't even need to be on Facebook. I can be like at the Recount or some other place. And then, you know, like, it seems to know who I am. And it's a little bit spooky, but that's just now the way my life works. And occasionally I get haunting messages asking me to change my password because something has gone wrong. And it's like, hey, we think it'd be a really good idea for you to change your password again. And you're like, what is this about? So that's the user experience for many of us. But the negative effects are actually much more profound than that, particularly if you're working in, let's say a democracy, where you wind up with people's preferences and viewpoints getting systematically changed by the fact that our data is getting tracked the way it is and sold and resold to people that want access to us and our attention. So data as a property right says that, look, our data is still ours, even if we decide to let this tech company use it in some way for our convenience. And so there are some rights that we should have to it. Number one, we should know anytime it's being sold and resold. We should have the ability to turn it off if we want. And if there's value that's changing hands, we should get some of it because it's literally our data. So those are some of the proposals that we're championing at Humanity Forward, and we're going to be launching an initiative next week to help activate people's data property rights around the country, particularly in the states of California and Nevada, because there are now laws on the books that
Right.
actually activate consumer data rights in those places. But those laws are now spreading around the country, and we are going to fight for people's ability to take ownership of their data and also benefit from the value.
Now, these large tech firms, even despite the tri-level crisis we're in, number one, they're doing extremely well on the stock market, but secondly, they are also in the news, and they're in the news because they're part now of the culture wars. And I'm curious what your view is on all the discussions that are going on in Washington at the moment about regulating big tech. And there are any number of, of vectors that we could discuss about that regulation. One of them certainly is data rights. But another one that's very much in the news right now has to do with First Amendment and the content moderation. Do you favor regulating or increasing regulations around how large platforms manage speech on their services?
As usual, DC is arriving on the scene way behind the curve, and then focusing on something that's, in my opinion, like not the key issue. Should Facebook be verifying the truth of political advertisements and other statements? Should it be taking on the same level of responsibility as, let's say, a cable network? Yes, it should. Like, to me, it's laughable that Facebook's like, we're a platform, we're not a publisher. I mean, you're literally like the biggest publisher in the world. Like every other publisher like is subject to you and your preferences and your algorithms. When they change policies, it like destroys legions of media companies, and they still pretend like, oh, it's not us. Like, we don't have any power point of view. I mean, you have more power than anybody at this point. So they need to grow up and take ownership of the truth of certain statements that are being made. And one very dark reality too that I think says it all is like they hired legions of contractors to try and draw the line of what's obscene, or what they should be redacting or deleting from Facebook. And so imagine being a human being who your job is just to witness like the worst stuff on the internet and say unacceptable.
The waking nightmare all day long.
Yeah, a waking nightmare. You know what that does to you? It traumatizes you. So now they're being sued by hundreds of contractors who are like, hey, I now have PTSD because like I had to drink from a digital cesspool for months on end. And Facebook's looking up being like, still not us, like, like, sure, we like actually like hired legions of humans to do this job, and now we're trying to pay them off because they're all in therapy. So Facebook should be taking responsibility for the content, and it should be recognizing its responsibility. Bigger picture, to me, Facebook's entire business model is built upon our preferences, our data. It's subverting our democracy for sure, but it's also subverting our mental health, our personalities, like our preferences, our points of view on things big and small. They need to have a different set of incentives. And that, to me, is where government should be paying most attention.
Yeah, well said. We're close to running out of time.
Oh, no.
I know. We're going to take a couple of questions from the audience, and I've got them over here. So if I'm looking this way, that's just because I'm looking at the questions. But before I take the audience questions, I have to ask you, and this is coming, what's next for Andrew Yang? Number one, are you going to run for the mayorship of New York City? That's been much in the air. And I'm going to leave that question and let you answer that. And then I have a follow-up.
Right now, I'm focused on helping Joe win in the fall and defeating Donald Trump. Because if Trump wins another 4 years, that's a potentially an unsurvivable scenario. So that's where my focus is. And if Joe does win, then we've been talking about my joining the administration in some capacity. But mission number one is just help Joe win.
Andrew Yang, Secretary of Labor.
Well, it's like that. Like, I want to solve the nation's problems, and obviously, if I have a chance to do so, then that's meaningful. Then, like, I'll take a very long look at it. So after November, then we'll look at what other opportunities there are, including the mayor's race and some other things.
But you find those interesting, and 2024 feels like a long way away. But you know what? 2020 felt like a long way away the day after election day 2016. But here we are. So you're not ruling out anything, are you?
Well, my motivations are the same as they've been, John, which is we need to solve some of these problems. And the problems are unfortunately getting bigger and more serious all the time. Our current legislators are not up to the challenge. They're completely out of touch. They don't really understand what needs to happen. And so as long as these things are true and I'm still a parent and a patriot, like, I'm just going to do everything I can to help.
Awesome. Quick, we have a couple of minutes to answer one or two audience questions. The first is, what training should we be offering our 18 to 24-year-olds? And will you be involved in that in some way? In other words, the next generation, what should they be learning?
18 to 24-year-olds is the college group. So number one, we should be investing in more vocational tracks and education that don't involve 4 years of college. I'm a fan of college. I went to college, but 35% of Americans will graduate from a 4-year university. Like, we need to open up different training paths for people who are in the other 65%. Then if you are going through any training program, we should try not to saddle you with tens of thousands or even like hundreds of thousands of dollars in education loans. So we need to lighten that up. In terms of the nature of the training, I'm a big fan of STEAM. The A is arts. Now, I'm not someone who thinks that.
So that's STEM, which is the science and math, with art.
Yeah. Now, I'm not someone who thinks that it's realistic for everyone to become like an engineer or coder, because like the numbers just don't line up that way, either in terms of us or the opportunities. But certainly investing more in those training paths is a very positive thing. I think that the main thing we need to try and give our young people is a sense of resilience and that they can grow and develop. And a lot of that isn't even necessarily like, oh, let me try and get this particular skill into you. It's like a degree of teamwork and grit and growth and adaptation. And there are different ways that people can get that are different courses of study. Like, it's not like, hey, you need to learn this, because one of the tough truths is that a lot of basic coding is going to be assumed by artificial intelligence over the next number of years. So it's like it's more about developing people's ability to grow and develop than it is like a very particular skill set.
Right. Good point. Well, I wish we could keep going for another 40 minutes, but unfortunately our time has lapsed. Andrew Yang, thank you so much for coming to JFF Horizons and for being in the world and bringing your platform out to millions and tens of millions of people. And I wish you the best of luck going forward.
Thank you, JFF. Keep up the great work. Thank you, John. And John, I don't know if I noticed this before, but you resemble. You probably gotten this before, but like, you just reminded me of like Kevin Kline from the movie Dave. It's like, between the two of us, I feel like you look awfully presidential yourself. I'm just, anyone who's watching this, just
Oh yeah, well,
do you get that?
More than happy to to play someone on television who's in politics. Other than that, I'll leave that to you. All right, over to you, Maria. Thank you very much again, Andrew.